Welcome back into the Cybersecurity Hub. I am your host and editor, Seth Adler. It's so good to be with you today. We had a great day yesterday, had a great session before this one, and now it is security as code, the best approach to cloud security. We're so excited to have Don Duet with us. We're going to do a poll right off the bat, though. We want to make sure that we understand your point of view. So we go ahead and please give us the answer to the question pushed live. If performed manually, what is the average length of time it takes to complete a security review of a single cloud application's infrastructure as code? I don't know is one of the answers, right? But we're looking for less than a day, less than a week, less than a month, less than 3 months, or more than 3 months, if you do know. And then, of course, there's the I don't know. So just one more time on that question. We'll go ahead and there's some answers coming in now. If performed manually, what is the average length of time it takes to complete a security review of a single cloud application's infrastructure as code? So less than a day, less than a week, less than a month, less than 3 months, more than 3 months, or I don't know. And it looks like we've got a bunch of folks, Don, that don't know. All right, so we'll have that there. We're going to go to the next poll right now. So the next poll is, how confident are you that your security requirements are being implemented correctly and consistently by cloud application developers? So again, that question, please do give us an answer. How confident are you that your security requirements are being implemented correctly and consistently by cloud application developers? Not at all confident, somewhat confident, moderately confident, very confident, extremely confident. So somewhat confident seems to be the way that we're thinking. And I feel like, Don, as we bring you in, Don Duet, that kind of both answers seem to be, average, right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. I think, a lot of people don't know the answer to the first one because a lot of companies don't really measure it well. And so it's hard to say. And of course, there's a lot of variability, small changes, large changes, et cetera. In terms of how long the confidence level of developers and,
comfortable that the implementation of security is right. I think,
again, it doesn't surprise me the answer, but increasingly, what we've continued to see with just this continued drumbeat of issues in cloud is that the confidence is eroding, that left alone is truly kind of the implementation of controls being done in a correct manner as people use the cloud more. So interesting responses, not surprising, very much, again, to your point, I think, middle of the fence, so in terms of response. But thank you very much as you responded to the polls.
You got it. All right, Don, we'll hand it over to you. We'll see you for live Q.
Awesome. Thank you. So good morning, everybody. I'm Don Duet. I'm the co-founder of Concourse Labs. Wanted to spend a couple moments with you today just talking about the concept of security as code and hopefully give some insights into how you can help drive and build a program around security as code based on some of the learnings that we've had in the industry, helping customers with this problem space. And so I just wanted to start by kind of a little bit of just taking a step back, to what is security as code, just to make sure that we're defining a bit more for this group, what our definition is, since there's a lot of information out there and there's a lot of different ways that people can perceive the terminology. But we see it as really kind of three principal components or three principles around kind of what the definition of security code is. And the first is that it really represents the shift from managing security from a perspective of look back into much more of a approach towards having declarative artifacts that express your controls, that define the implementation of those controls to ensure that as you begin to kind of move forward into much more of a multi-cloud journey, that you're able to have a base of control that's ultimately declarative in nature. So that's point number one. The second point is that it really involves, therefore, that creation of that code that's representing the declarative artifacts that are representing your control objectives means that you needed to actually go through a process of formalizing, what are the risk objectives that you have? what are the things that you need to be protecting against, and really developing that into what becomes a much more formalized catalog of controls that then can be converted into software through the implementation of those control objectives. And then the last point that I'd say is that we very much, kind of believe that security code is not a brand new thing, that it's really kind of an extension of much of the value proposition that people have seen through much of their investment in infrastructure as code, as many of you are probably adopting DevOps type philosophies and approaches for the procurement of your cloud. So really kind of building on or standing on the shoulders of a lot of the giants that led that way, of the idempotent declarative infrastructure movement, to now begin to express that into more of the types of things that we would relate to security and control type objectives. So that's how we define security as code, just to start the discussion with a common point. So why is it so important, and why do we think that it's critical for most institutions as they begin to again adopt much more of a digital strategy revolving around public cloud, to be thinking about this problem and ultimately driving a security as code framework? And we think it's pretty fundamental that when you look at kind of the approach that many people are taking as they have looked historically on kind of as they developed software and solutions on premise versus the approach for moving to public cloud, or the way that they're implementing public cloud, it is fundamentally different. And so we very much see this paradigm shift across all aspects of the security and control structure, starting with just software delivery, as we see agile being adopted as really the principal form of continuous delivery and agile for use of public cloud. That certainly creates immediately a material difference in the planning cycle, the opportunities to inject kind of controls because of the duration and the pace at which things are changing. The overall message around public cloud and cloud in general is just empowerment, and it's about speed. It's being able to make changes faster, deliver solutions faster, enable more people to do more things in a way that ultimately gets business value as rapidly as possible. And so this whole underlying theme of in the world that we've operated in for many decades, which had a lot of iteration, but was generally speaking slow relative to the space of cloud and the speed at which changes are occurring in cloud, and again the entire architecture for cloud and business proposition really being designed for this aspect of agility and speed as first and foremost. And then from an infrastructure perspective, we really see the shift from the ability to think about hardware as being a core part of the control process and mechanism to everything software. So you're obviously renting the hardware in the cloud, but you're really many more people to be able to make decisions about what types of services they're going to be using in the cloud, and therefore losing to some degree the control points that historically had been in place for really thinking about the firewall perhaps as the hardware implementation of control, and needing to shift a lot of that up into your perspective of software and configuration of services really as being the control point. And then from a security perspective, we could debate this for a lot. I'm just going to kind of frame this in pretty simple terms, but the inherent risk of being in the cloud is high, relative to the inherent risk of being in an on-premise world where you control the network and you control the physical environments. And so, there's clearly, a debate about cloud security that we're not going to have today, but ultimately, we see the intrinsic risks of being in cloud as being substantial, that the ability to mitigate those risks through software is also incredibly high, but being able to do it and ensure that you're really driving your program in that way is a necessary factor. And then lastly, from a control perspective, when you think about historically the perimeter of your data center being kind of the place that you can really apply a lot of your ingress, egress type controls, that as you move forward into the public cloud, which really has no physical perimeter that really needs to be supporting logical perimeters, that security as code becomes an essential part, whether that's securing a landing zone or UPC or securing a specific application, that the approach to where you're going to apply ultimately your security and controls really needs to shift into a different form of perimeter than your historical one, and therefore into a different set of control planes. So when you take a step back and you think about the change that many of people in security, teams and groups are dealing with as they start to move into this hybrid multi-cloud environment, that these are all meaningful factors of change that need to be managed and dealt with. And of course, they're also happening at a pace, at a speed that's just faster. As most companies really begin to drive their digitization strategy, then you have more applications, more data, across likely more, cloud providers, all that becomes a denominator effect of, how many ways we're going to support. And so the ability to think about security as code really becomes kind of a core and essential value proposition for helping offset some of this complexity, some of this agility and speed by moving it into, again, a software-defined paradigm. So one of the most important things that we find, though, when people start to think about security as code and think about really how am I going to really embrace security in the cloud, is very much becomes a strategy question. We think first and foremost of what is my approach going to be? How do I want to manage that? How do I want to deal with the dual challenges of wanting to support the ability to have high empowerment and really enable the business value propositions of the cloud, of being able to move fast and create new solutions, with some of the challenges that come with being, whether you're regulated or not, of making sure and being able to prove that you're in control. So when we look at the last 10 years of cloud, a lot of the approach that we saw in security was to really focus on, with terminology like shift left, but focus on a much more federated approach. So having less of a centralized control team or security team, go down a path of much more enabling developers to build and operate the controls that are necessary with oversight. And so we get a little bit of a Goldilocks scenario here, where the federated model gives a lot of enforcement that's scores high. But the challenge as you start to grow your usage of cloud, as you have more apps, more teams, more software, that the visibility and control becomes harder to manage. And so we've seen examples where in a highly federated approach to security as control, that some of the people, institutions that we work with spend as much time, energy, and effort and cost just trying to check and confirm that those controls are being implemented correctly, and really kind of being able to understand, as you get into the cloud sprawl challenge, like, where are those controls? Have they been tested? Were they written correctly? And of course, everything changes, including the cloud itself. So is the continuous life cycle around that being operated. And on the right-hand side, of course, on the other side of the spectrum, trying to build a very centralized model just creates, friction. It creates challenges in terms of, how do you kind of enable the business value and proposition of cloud? How do you kind of really support, the concept of one size fits all in a world that has, a lot of different shapes and a lot of diversity, particularly in the enterprise. And so, both of those become a challenge. What we very much focus on, and we kind of advise our clients to be thinking through, is to think about this in a mode where you can support both central and decentralized. So you can maintain a security content layer that you can think of as your cloud management plane for content, for your security as code that can be on an enterprise basis, that can support the ability to have federation where appropriate, and then have a very distributed and federated execution plane. So being able to not try to create the roadblocks and bottlenecks, but really enabling the creation over time of what becomes an enterprise repo of all your controls and your control content, with the ability to support and facilitate highly federated developer journey. So try to make sure that we're getting the best value out of the content and the visibility and the awareness and the comfort levels, that the implementations are correct, but not getting in the way of all the benefits of having continuous build pipelines and disparate solutions in terms of your developer profile. So this is where we think the world is going, is really down this enterprise path of thinking about how do you support security in a way that really balances these two objectives and gives a much better solution for the enterprise. So I'm going to talk now about really kind of the three major components that we see when people are looking to build and design a security as code program, that we think are the pillars, if you would, that are necessary to really be kind of thinking about and building towards in order to make that successful. And I'm going to start with what in some ways is probably the most obvious, but often the least kind of focused on when we work with real customers, in terms of, it's probably the most important part of the process. And it's the most, in some ways it's the least technical in terms of, challenge, but it's often the one that's really not thought of in the front of the process, and people often deal with the challenges at the back end, which is just really establishing your governance overall framework. So how do you, in a company of any size, from the smallest firms to the most complex global, international firms, how do you define ultimately the ownership for security as code? How do you, the cloud, as my team always reminds me, is a team sport. So how do you ensure that all the different groups across different forms of actors are working together in a way that's collaborative to drive ultimately the shared outcomes that are there? How do you define and ultimately create a role and responsibility structure that supports the ability to map people and roles to specific problems and specific responsibilities? So, how do you look at the different jurisdictions in your organization? Who's allowed to define controls for which part of your your cloud usage or your business, which are the people that are allowed to see the results. So there's a very fundamental aspect here of really thinking through the governance framework that is going to be essential to underpin what becomes kind of the trust layer, so that as you're looking at results of findings from a policy as code or security as code part of your infrastructure that's operating, how can you trust it? How can you know that it's correct? Who actually defined it? How do you know that person had the responsibility to decide those were the right set of rules? And so we see this whole aspect of really defining that governance layer to be essential, to be very important, and ultimately, as I said earlier, unfortunately, the last thing many people try to solve for, even though it really becomes, from a successful program perspective, one of the first and most important things people should be focused on. So just to give some examples of how we've helped with that problem, first off, we think of it as very much an access and role-based problem. So we've created within our product a set of roles that we think span the requirement set for cloud governance. That would include concepts like policy authors, so who's allowed to write policy. Support the ability for people who are what we would think of as a business author. So who is the person that actually has the ability to define applications and publish those applications into the cloud. And obviously also supports different concepts for operators. So who actually is the person that is responsible for fixing issues and fixing findings and ensuring that the environment is as safe as possible. And so we've built a process here and a collection of roles that you can map into your organization that supports the ability to really create a basis for the governance around moving security and extending security as we have more and more people that are being involved in it. We also support the concept of responsibilities for each role, so that not only can you be a policy author, but perhaps a collection of your policy authors are going to also be viewed as policy approvers, so they can support, have the ability to ensure that there's segregation of duty and that you have the ability to have controls in place that allow for changes to policy being reviewed before they're actually published into your environments. But there's many of these types of responsibilities and structures. The main point here is that getting them designed, getting them thought out, building them as an essential starting point in your security as code journey, again, is essential in our experience, given just the need to have a basis of trust and a basis of comfort that as you can go down this journey of building more and more software-defined artifacts and software-defined assets, that it's starting from a basis of, this is how you've authorized. We also see we see this more certainly in complex organizations, that having the ability to do roles is essential for the aspect of governance, just as it is essential often for other forms of permissions that you may have around your cloud usage. And so the ability to think in this case about segmentation more in the context of, who's allowed to make which decisions for what parts of my cloud, since the cloud presents more of a flat landscape from a technical perspective, but that the actual usage of cloud and your business usage of cloud often have its own definitions and hierarchy. So the ability to have teams perhaps that can deploy controls across the entirety of the firm that are maybe in a more centralized security group, commingled with teams that are supporting the ability to write or manage controls that are only for their own application or perhaps across different regions. So this ability to really think about the cloud less as a flat model, but thinking as a segmented structure where you can apply controls and ownership and responsibilities in a way that really fits to your business and your usage of your organization. We've seen this as extremely important. It also helps a lot with this challenge of like, where do I start? How do I want to start a governance program? If I want to start with something that's going to feel like it's completely comprehensive for everything I do in my company, then that's an Everest type climb. And so the ability to break that down into smaller modules that are much more, have a higher affinity to the way you run and operate, that this ability to think about the access based of roles in a way that the roles are constant, but the approach, who's allowed access to those roles can become really driven by your business and your business usage. So it's become very helpful. And ultimately it allows us to arrive at what we think of as a virtualization of governance, so that the term of governance and Again, the big picture of ensuring that you have well-defined controls and responsibilities can be fragmented or brought into a much more consumable unit where you can do this by people, by group, whatever dimension you wish to kind of slice your environment into. But it allows you to have a complete perspective where for each one of these kind of virtualized governance models that you may have in your environment, that you have, who are the people and roles and responsibilities, what are the actual policies that need to apply to that, what is the scope of my cloud or the segment of my cloud that it operates over, in a way that becomes consistent, can support automation and support trust, but does this in a very kind of way that becomes much more consumable for complicated organizations and allows you to be pragmatic in how you can drive progress. And ultimately, the objective of all of this, when we think about why the governance piece is so important, is that it enables over time the ability not just to have a source of truth for what are the rules and who made those rules and how were they given the rights to have those rules, but that having that set of rules supports fundamentally automation. And so it supports the ability to answer questions like, is this service acting correctly, or should this service even be operating in this, or whatever you want to look at, but having that underpinning of a trustful collection of rules that you can, as an organization, say we can be comfortable that represents, what is our risk posture, what is our kind of security and control posture in an authoritative way, just enables and opens the door for many places now that we can drive automation and efficiency. So that's the first piece, is the establishing that ownership perspective that becomes, again, it's sort of like the starting point and the most important in many ways. But managing code itself and managing controls becomes its own set of challenges. And again, I would say as companies look to grow and as they become more and more technologically dense, this problem, of course, gets even more challenging. So what we really look at is the ability for people to build a secure security as code program that can become scalable becomes often the problem. So how do I, as I get more and more infrastructure as code artifacts, we've already talked about, how do I know where they are and how do I know who's responsible for them? That's starting point one. But second, how do I know that they work? How do I know that they're actually meeting the objectives of what they were? How do I know what they actually were even designed for? And so this whole aspect of how do you think about this collection of software artifacts, time, there's a enterprise story here that we've seen help people become very successful with building their programs by really focusing on a couple of points. One, as we said before, that formalization of what are the controls that I need to operate in different parts of my cloud. So building what we would call a catalog that really defines effectively your control objectives that are independent from the implementation of those control objectives is really essential. I think most companies in the world would probably say that at somewhere in their security organization there exists a spreadsheet that becomes their control standards. You're bringing that spreadsheet out of the single user mode and into ultimately a core part of the enterprise IP for security as code, we think is an essential part of the success problem or success factor. And so having that ability to say, I know what my control objectives are, they're going to change over time. They may have a lot of veracity to them, but I'm going to have them in a first class way that I can understand them, define them, change them, version them is incredibly important. And then secondly, having them agnostic to the actual implementation of those controls, since those controls may be different, or the implementation may be different in different cloud providers and different scenarios, but that becomes a very important piece. And then of course, the association and having an integrated architecture so that as you do build your control implementations of those objectives, that they can be directly integrated. So I can walk effectively from what are my control objectives down into what are the actual implementations of those controls, and then ultimately into what is the actual performance of that control implementation becomes incredibly important from an architecture perspective and from a design perspective in order to support this growing amount of artifacts that you'll have, growing number of implementations that you'll have, the amount of change that's going to be backed by that as you continue to both improve, modify, and enhance your security and control posture, but also as you're continuously managing the code that becomes the implementation. So having that type of architecture, we see really as that second step in the design. That's again super important, incredibly important again for organizations that are going to have a lot of design implementation complexity. But ultimately, back to the point of really driving the value proposition of saying I can have automation and I can prove that it's correct and true, and I can understand, why it was there for is ultimately the important piece. So again, some examples just to walk through. So in our product, the ability to think about, again, the creation over time of catalogs, whether that be, my catalog for my entire firm or my catalog for this part of my business. And that those catalogs represent or can be represented from third-party standards. So I can look at different types of solutions and standards that are available, like CIS or CSA or NIST, or even from the cloud providers. Their own kind of security benchmarks and standards can become inputs and ultimately could become the entirety of your catalog. But most clients are going to have, or at least most people that we see, will ultimately end up kind of building and designing to where there is a independent set of catalogs for their own business. And these catalogs, really are going to be based on the control objective perspective. So having a well-defined definition of what is the objective of my control that, again, is independent, if you would, of the implementation, and is granular enough that it really provides an understandable explanation of the exposures and risks that you're looking to protect and ensure that you're meeting, or the objectives you're meeting, but is also kind of broad enough that it's not going to become impossible to manage. And so for those of you who have been in there, as part of your career, have helped build control standards, this probably looks very similar to what you've seen. Again, a big part of this we've seen in making security as code become actually working, from a scale perspective, is really getting it again out of the spreadsheet up into what becomes a living and breathing core set of artifacts that's being managed ultimately as software itself, but is being managed independently of the implementation. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, being able to associate these control objectives to the actual policies that you have. So, for the various objectives that I have, what are the policies now that I'm going to be writing or be defining that are going to be at a more specific level of implementation? In this case, we're using kind of a public access for blobs to be ensuring that they're set to private. So this is where you start to find that this is where we begin to get into that intersection point between this is my objective of control. Here's now the ability to start talking about how I'm implementing those controls and what are the specifics I want that could be on a per service basis or on a per service provider basis, but all of this being in an integrated and supportable chain. And then lastly, we get into the implementation itself. Like, how do I see not just, this is the objective and this is the way that I want to implement that objective, but here's the actual code. Here's the actual software that is ultimately becoming
control as code that's running and operating.
And getting all this into what becomes a virtuous landscape is essential for, again, companies that are going to have the desire and need to ensure that they have control between what they chose to do, how they're actually meeting their standards, all the way down to the implementation of those controls, and then ultimately into the findings. So again, very, very important, a very big piece of the puzzle. Very much, something that, again, where we've seen companies that have been very successful at driving security as code, that thinking this through and getting this implemented has been incredibly important in their ability to manage at scale and support just the continuous change cycles that they operate under. And then lastly, from a control perspective, or the last pillar that we're going to talk about, is that as we're doing all of this, as we're creating this ability to have a trusted source of truth for what all my needs and controls are, the association of that source of truth into what becomes a risk-based control catalog and implementation is now, how do I actually inject that? How do I actually take those controls and apply them? And we, look at this as really kind of fundamentally a process of thinking about this as almost a security API. And so the ability, again, to support enforcement of controls in a federated manner, linking those to events that occur in various aspects of your software and application lifecycle, and really looking at it comprehensively. So from an objective perspective, get guardrails that can be injected everywhere from your SCM and how you're actually creating and committing software, all the way up through your runtime. So the entire cycle can benefit and should benefit over time from being able to inject the control logic and the ability to assert security as code at every stage in the process, and applying it both to cloud services as well as to workloads and identity. And doing this, of course, within an automation framework, so that you're really getting towards a ability to say, I have continuous audit. I'm not, doing periodic audit. I'm just, everything that's done, every event that takes place over time, has its own set of verifications. And therefore, I'm really able to zipper up and seal up my control objectives from how I actually build, deliver, distribute, and operate my cloud. That may sound daunting to many people, given where, kind of many of you may be in terms of your journey, but it's ultimately, it's a progressive process. You don't need to do it all day one. We've, worked with people that have focused much more on the immediacy on the development side, like getting as far upstream and SCM and into their CI/CD. We've worked with others that have started with much more at the runtime, and then progressively building up towards and into much more of the developer process. But getting to where you can have a framework for visibility, control, and collaboration, and the ability to integrate that into all of your processes over time is really what enables the creation of a sound and a very strong governance framework for security as code. Just some examples here. So, thinking again about the team sport point, people have very different experiences. So, the DevOps team, this would maybe much more representative of their view of the world, which will look more like a Jenkins or a Git or, some form of their CI/CD view of life. And so being able to integrate the control objectives of security as code directly into their experiences makes a lot of sense. It makes them much more efficient. And again, here's an example where we just show how you can, as you're creating build pipelines, you can do various forms of control checks at every stage, from the checkout through the compliance checks themselves prior to deployment, and then even post deployment. But being able to represent all this assets that as you build out your security as code program, and just bring it into the experiences in a very differentiated way. We also think that it's very important to not, again, lose the efficacy of understanding, the identity of, so, I may have hundreds or thousands of pipelines over time, and I therefore may have thousands of different controls that I want to operate in different ways against those pipelines. How do I manage that? So, having the ability to really think about identity for workloads and identity for pipelines, maintaining that as a stable, view of the pipeline, supporting the ability to associate controls against that, and being able to just manage that comprehensively becomes a very important part of making this scalable and operate. And of course, for the security teams, getting access and visibility into the software itself, can often be a challenge today, because if you have to reach out to different teams or try and find, where is the Git repo that piece of code actually is in, that can be challenging in a large company. And so bringing that content, or having the ability to kind of create, as part of your security as code framework, an overall approach to transparency is essential. And so part of having workload identity is it also supports that ability to bring the actual version of the actual code in a way that you can introspect it to see. And of course, as you think about the life cycle of policy, and including testing of that policy, this becomes all, very important in that capability to the underlying artifacts. And of course, the runtime is also there too. And so how can I look at, what my cloud actually is? How was it constructed from all these different developer experiences? And how can I apply policy against that, that maybe to just verify that it's remaining kind of as, by design consistent, and looking for drift, or maybe looking at different forms of policies that may expand or span across, various developer journeys and experiences. So having this ability to integrate your controls through API into multiple forms of your development experience, from the very upfront SCM all the way to the runtime, is an incredibly important part of building your program. So those are the 3 steps. I just wanted to kind of summarize, and I know we're going to maybe have some chance for some Q&A. But ultimately, we see, just to summarize what we've talked about, I think, first and foremost is, for any enterprise that's on a path towards really embracing multi-cloud hybrid architecture, and believing that it's going to be having increasingly larger amounts of data and applications, we see security as code as just an absolute necessity for really supporting and managing that complexity. Developing a program requires thought and leadership, but will yield amazing results as you can really kind of support the ability to enable business empowerment, enable the ability to innovate faster, and really reduce the need for people to be doing tasks that can be done through automation, but having an approach that really facilitates that and is thoughtful about how to design and create it is absolutely necessary. And that, again, this point about security as code, most people think about it as being a technical conversation about, do I use this language versus that the first and foremost, defining your governance structure, defining how you're going to manage yourself, how you're going to maintain trust across all these different people and responsibilities is just essential. So, I want to underscore that again of, the three things that we've talked about, getting that sorted first is been by far the most important key to successful programs. And then supporting, the other pieces that we, the other major components of having a code library, having the ability to deal with the sprawl challenge by really investing in building a catalog-based approach. We see that as very successful, as well as having that ability to enforce the, dynamically through events that occur, having the API-based approach to enforcing, in a very federated way, your security and control objectives, that it really reduces that historical challenge of security equals, bad or painful, and really kind of enables the ability to have very focused, very specialized, and very integrated, capabilities, because you don't need to go and create agents or do other things. You're just going to the event source and applying logic at that point in time. So that's my overview. So happy to turn it back, and love to see if there's questions from the group. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, we definitely have some questions here. Don, thanks so much. Really appreciate your insight there. So let's dive into these questions. What would be a good framework to start security as code? You might have mentioned it. Let's dive in.
Yeah, I think the most important thing, what we see, is just that recognition point. I think one of the biggest challenges that we see in most corporations is like, whose job is this? And, it's easy sometimes for the security teams to feel like, well, this must be somebody else's responsibility. But I would say, what we're increasingly seeing is that the role of the security or the CISO is just expanding as companies embrace cloud. That it's like somebody has to care about this, someone has to drive this. Ultimately, it may be in some organizations led by a cloud infrastructure group or otherwise. But, when you think about the efficacy of having a control model that really supports digitization in your business, increasingly we are seeing that the ownership of this is starting to really come from the CISOs. And we think that that's great. We think that that's correct. It really kind of drives that ability to have a seat at the table, to be in a leadership role. But that often is the hardest part. Like, how do you just get started? How do you actually kind of make sure as you're getting started that you're thinking about, the future, not just about the immediacy of right now, and really thinking about how to build a program that's going to support the scale and complexity of your business.
Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you for that. Let's get to the next question. So it sounds like the shift we are seeing, but our challenge, let's start from the beginning. You've got me interested in security as code. What recommendations do you have for getting started? Some of the previous answer might apply here.
Yeah, I think obviously getting started, as we said before, it's really identifying who's the owner, and how do we start to move this forward. I think one thing that we've underpinned from what I just talked about is that having this ability to really think about the control implementation or enforcement as a federated problem. So I'm going to be integrating controls into many different aspects of my event-based security or my application lifecycle is super important. It also, in many ways, makes it easier to get started, because as you define your initial set of rules and content of what you want to make sure you're operating, what are those guardrails that you want to make sure you're having and meeting, you can start immediately injecting those into different control points. And it's, as I said earlier, it's not an invasive process. And I think that's one of the things that, often if you're sitting in the security team, you may feel a little bit like, what's my ability to be influential with my DevOps groups or my application developers? And isn't it really hard to kind of get, kind of things integrated into my software, kind of process? And, I think the good news here, not to say that it's magic, but, is that having this approach and really saying, if I can just, insert an API call into different parts of my control environments, that the integration of that is, the cost is low, and often kind of the impact to your constituents is low as well. But it really gives you that basis to start to move forward incrementally, and then to build upon the successes. Also, just last thing I'd say is that what we've seen clearly in most of the corporate landscape has been that the ability to define guardrails and manage guardrails has been very empowering to developers. And developers, as long as they have transparency, their ability to see and know what are the rules you're applying to them, and in a way that they can see it in the language that they understand, that we've seen a lot of people embracing this, frankly, getting out of my way by making sure that I don't make foolish mistakes is actually something that most businesses and most developers and most enterprises that we've seen actually want. And so it really kind of changes the relationship between the security and the developer and DevOps teams into one that's really in the same language. You understand APIs, you understand code, I understand APIs, I understand code. I'm bringing my APIs and code to your environment in a way that we can now make this efficient, and we can make this automated, and we can get people out of the way. That tends to be a very empowering story for security teams.
All right, great. So you mentioned security as code programs require a collective approach. How do you get individuals to engage in security as code program design and implementation?
Yes, I think it's a little bit of what we just asked. A little bit just following on my prior answer. I think one, ensuring that you're creating what is a shared common objective, and so I think for most people in looking at the world from a security perspective, that common objective is to say, I want to get everybody to the extent possible to really both understand security better, but also to feel like they have a role to play in it in a way that also, but also recognizing they may not always have the same incentives that I do. And so I think, this ability to, bring the language of security into the language that's going to be understandable to the developer, understandable to the DevOps person, underpinning it with the objective of saying, we want to make you more productive. We want to get out of your way. We want to support the ability to make sure we're safe and fast. That that fundamentally changes the dialogue, really makes a much more of a cultural compatibility. And I think it's helped grow a lot of kind of the adoption in organizations where maybe historically there would be a fear factor of, would people buy into this? Would they see this as bureaucracy versus see this as something that's empowering to them? And so again, I think doing it through an automation lens, doing it through a way that's going to be compatible from an API and data, API and code perspective, really does help drive the desire for people to participate, to want to make sure that this happens, because it enables them to be more successful, enables them to do more things that they want to do, and it can be done in a way that's both fully transparent, but also is really kind of not creating obstacles.
Great. All right. And just as a final point here, do you mind diving in on scale? How to scale all this?
Yes, the scale is super important, and a lot of the the logic and a lot of the investments that we've made, both in thinking about this problem and then obviously in how we've designed and built our product, was designed for this challenge of scale. Because again, organizations are very complicated. There's a lot of diversity. So the way that you may want to think about what's an appropriate set of controls and security for this application versus that there's a desire, of course, to drive commonality, but the reality of the world is that that's very difficult to do without substantial dilution in the quality of your controls. And so I think from a scale perspective, super important that these abstractions that we've talked about of having well-defined roles and governance framework, having a design of your implementation of code so that it can be supporting the separation of control objectives to control implementation, so you can continuously add, improve, and enhance both of those independently and rev and test them independently. I mean, all this helps create scale. It creates scale that supports the ability to say I can have things that are logically different. I can have the ability to have objectives that I want that maybe are aspirational, and I want to be kind of measuring how I'm getting there, but maybe I can't get there today. And so all that comes down to having an architecture and a design that both reflects the fact that it's a very diverse and complicated problem to be solving for, and therefore it needs that kind of investment, but ultimately that it also supports the ability to move incrementally. So you can let people that maybe are super advocates for wanting their code to be even want to use security as code aggressively, let them race forward. And those that maybe want to just be kind of laggards and kind of pull what you have as your standards that are from what, like that all that can be supported in the architecture that we've outlined. Okay.
And in less than a minute, to add to the question on scale, how do you see the staffing model for security as code with federated ownership and the various catalogs of cloud services? What does the resource plan look like? Quickly, please.
Yeah, I think it's super important for people because the scarcity of resources, finding people that are really great in security and understand cloud. I mean, I think we all know that that's an incredibly difficult skill set to get. So by design, think about having a team of core kind of security experts that you leverage technologies and approach like what we've outlined to let them become scalable, so that you can have a small number of people that really understand this. That ultimately are your authors of control implementations, and really kind of let the software and let the technology make them superhuman by getting it out into all sorts of aspects of your environment. But assuming that you're going to hire a lot of people that are going to be able to do this is probably a bad strategy to start with, just given the scarcity of experience and expertise, and the need to kind of grow that over time versus design for that upfront.
All right, I've got to get to the next session. Don, thank you so much for your time. Very much appreciate you guys sponsoring. For everybody in attendance, thank you for being here. Let's meet in the next session. And thank Don one more time for your time and your insights, sir. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
All right. Talk to you soon.